He secured heavy sacks of stones to her body, then used a full roll of duct tape to completely cover her face. He forced her onto a small boat, even though Misty was still totally conscious and breathing at that time. I genuinely believe she fought relentlessly to break free, shaking her face until the adhesive slipped off, pleading frantically for mercy. He mercilessly shoved her over the edge into the absolute darkest depths of the water, watching her vanish below. I am completely convinced he tossed her into the rushing river while she was fully awake, understanding the terrible reality that she was absolutely going to drown. Even with overwhelming forensic evidence and undeniably damning circumstances stacked against him, Huck boldly claimed total innocence. I hesitate to call our position absolutely bulletproof, but the prosecution feels incredibly secure about the mountain of proof. He mapped out a twisted strategy in his head, assuming every single detail would unfold perfectly. However, the situation quickly spiraled completely out of his control. Looking back at that terrifying moment, I vividly recall just completely holding my breath in pure suspense. My entire body was completely tense right up until the moment the jury announced a conviction on every charge. The only thought flooding my mind right then was a massive wave of pure relief and gratitude. The 28-year-old defendant, Brent Huck, received a lifelong sentence behind bars. Does this truly feel fair to us? Real payback would mean locking her father in a room with that monster for a solid hour. Now that is what I would call a proper punishment. Execution is simply too easy because I need him rotting inside a cell for the next 500 years. He needs to wake up every single morning haunted by his own terrible actions. People can throw around words about the legal system working, but my heart remains broken regardless. At the very least, I can find some comfort knowing he will never have the chance to harm another innocent person again. This was a calculated hit, a ruthless assassination designed to leave no survivor. A gruesome crimson path stretched from the bedroom straight to the entrance, kicking off a twisted puzzle involving several potential culprits. Our immediate priority became zeroing in on those crucial last 24 hours to figure out exactly who crossed their path. The guy frequently voiced his deadly intentions, constantly claiming those two absolutely had it coming. The woman promised to drop by and unleash gunfire on his legal practice, knowing full well he stood to inherit the whole incredibly lucrative operation. The stakes were insanely high, involving astronomical fortunes reaching deep into the 7 figures. Everything was about to come into the light, so I told him clearly that only a couple of scenarios were going to play out that afternoon. I explained that I was heading home while he was going to prison for murder, which is an unfortunate reality that happens daily across the continent. Cracking the most baffling murder investigations always hinges on dissecting the exact events of the victim's final 24 hours. Investigators have to meticulously piece together that essential sequence of events to finally uncover the truth. Those fleeting moments hold the vital clues needed to expose the perpetrator and solve the entire enigma. Tucked just a short drive beneath Miami sits Coral Gables, an upscale paradise overflowing with pure extravagance. The scenery is absolutely stunning, with all those winding canals earning the neighborhood its reputation as the local version of Venice. This community stays exceptionally peaceful and secure, meaning violent crimes almost never happen around these parts. However, that tranquility was brutally destroyed back in August of 2004, beginning with a frantic 911 recording where a confused victim screamed about taking mysterious gunfire. The first responding cops pulled up to the property and immediately encountered the homeowner standing right at the entryway. Blood was pouring from his skull, and the patrolman quickly spotted additional traumatic injuries tearing up his fingers and collarbone area. The authorities demanded answers, prompting his dazed confession about taking a bullet before the cops urgently questioned him about other potential victims indoors. He confirmed his spouse was still trapped inside, leading the squad straight into an absolutely horrific scene of carnage. The primary zone of violence was located right inside the southeastern sleeping quarters where the husband had initially taken the hits. A massive streak of red smeared the floorboards continuously from his private quarters all the way to the main entrance. The wife's lifeless body remained completely still on her mattress in the opposite wing, while her partner suffered several devastating blasts straight to his visage. The guy was clinging to life by a thread, forcing paramedics to rush him straight over to the nearest trauma center. While the ambulance tore toward the emergency room, an elite squad of Miami-Dade murder investigators immediately geared up for action. The lead detectives officially took on the immense burden of hunting down the monster responsible for slaughtering the beloved wife. Their mission immediately shifted to digging up every single hidden truth buried within the final 24 hours of her existence. Nailing down the chronological events remains essential to constructing a rock-solid investigation, meaning you need to trace the victim's exact footsteps prior to the attack. Tracking their activities and companions is mandatory, considering any tiny connection could point straight toward the guilty party. Getting a statement out of the only living witness quickly evolved into the squad's absolute biggest focus right out of the gate. Unfortunately, the injured husband hovered on the brink of death while enduring a brutal 14-hour operation just to stabilize his vital organs. Nobody expected the guy to pull through, leaving us heavily, assuming the investigation was about to officially escalate into something far worse. We honestly believed we were dealing with a devastating twin murder scenario. My body was completely failing me, mostly due to bleeding out all over the hallway floor. A priest actually delivered my final blessings when Monday rolled around, then completely repeated the grim ceremony again on Tuesday. By some absolute miracle, my vitals stabilized halfway through the week, and I finally turned a corner toward recovery. The survivor ultimately broke out of his chemical slumber, only to discover a squad of determined cops crowding his hospital bed for clues. The poor guy fought through the brain fog to reconstruct the massacre, though the sheer violence of the attack left massive blank spaces in his recollection. His confusion went way beyond mere adrenaline, especially since the projectile tearing through his skull completely severed his optic nerves. My entire body was wrecked, so whenever the heavy painkillers faded away, the sheer agony hit me simultaneously alongside the terrifying realization that my vision was gone completely. The actual blast to my cranium got completely wiped from my memory, forcing the events of that horrific evening to trickle back in chaotic little flashes. My heavy breathing problem usually forced my spouse and me to grab shut-eye in completely different quarters. Right around 10 o'clock at night, perhaps slightly earlier than that, my wife headed off to her designated sleeping area. I stepped into the washroom for a second, and that was exactly when a massive explosive noise shattered the quiet. The sound totally confused me, yet I figured my partner would definitely scream for assistance if a real emergency was actually going down. I just wandered back to the mattress and sat down, completely oblivious, until a shadowy intruder wearing a dark cap suddenly breached the doorway. Dark clothing, top to bottom, and then the bullets started flying. I honestly felt like somebody pushed me headfirst into the dirt, leaving my brain completely scrambled and unable to process the chaos. Even though he tried his hardest to help, the grieving husband barely gave law enforcement any useful clues. The victim clearly never met his attacker before that night, considering he could not recall a single physical detail about the gunman. After spending several days floating between waking life and a dark void, investigators finally got the heartbreaking opportunity to break the tragic news about his spouse. My entire emotional system just shut down, making it impossible to comprehend the past, process the present, or even think about the future because my mind went completely blank. Missing her memorial service still eats away at my conscience, while his immense grief is magnified by the baffling questions surrounding her brutal murder. When looking at this through a detective's lens, you absolutely must figure out which specific individual the shooter actually wanted dead. Did the gunman come specifically for the husband, leaving his poor wife as nothing more than an unfortunate casualty? Or did a furious enemy target her directly, catching him in the crossfire just by sheer bad luck, which a subtle piece of evidence left behind might soon explain? The first cop on the scene noted a breached patio door sitting at the total opposite end of the property from the actual bloodbath. Our team definitely floated the theory of a standard burglary, or maybe a break-in that escalated into violence, though the physical evidence quickly tore that hypothesis apart. High-end diamond rings and flashy necklaces were scattered all across the house. Stacks of paper bills and plastic lay right out in the open, meaning a thief could have easily stuffed their pockets full of treasure before making a quick getaway. Except the intruder ignored the valuables entirely, choosing instead to march past every room in the building just to reach the furthest possible corner, opened fire on the couple, and immediately sprinted right back out, leaving the authorities with just one chilling conclusion. The sheer number of gunshot wounds decorating her body practically screamed that the killer harbored a deeply personal vendetta. This horrific event was a calculated hit where the perpetrators clearly aimed to wipe out the parents as well as their boy. Nailing down the murderer ultimately meant tracing back every single person the victim spoke with during the 24 hours leading up to the tragedy. Investigators soon discovered that the family hosted a festive evening meal shortly before the nightmare began. The doomed woman actually prepared her own special supper that night, tossing together a lively Tex-Mex inspired dish. Looking back at the guest list, the table included her loyal spouse, their grown boy, along with his romantic partner, that lovely young lady named Juliet, plus the husband's trusted legal associate named Teddy. The attorney was practically a relative to them, while the girlfriend coincidentally worked the reception desk at the exact same legal practice. Both men spent their days fighting major courtroom battles, and they used the dinner to clink glasses over a massive recent victory. Securing a huge payout from a heavy-hitting lawsuit definitely gave the whole crew a reason to pop some champagne. The business partner swore to the cops that he showed up right at 7 o'clock and dipped out by 9:30 that evening. That specific time frame crowned him as the absolute final guest to lay eyes on the doomed pair before the bullets flew. Bizarrely enough, the exact same guy managed to be the premier spectator standing outside the yellow tape. Delivering the gruesome news of her immediate passing fell directly on my shoulders, and the man absolutely broke down, sobbing while looking utterly devastated. His hysterical crying fit struck me as weirdly theatrical compared to how a typical buddy might process sudden grief. He shared absolutely zero DNA with the victims and merely crashed at a totally different property as a pal. Digging deeper into the colleague's story rapidly transformed the investigators' initial intrigue into a blazing red alert. The guy casually mentioned his hobby of firing off rounds at weekend tournaments, offering a super convenient excuse for any microscopic explosive dust we might swab off his palms. While knee-deep in hunting down a vicious killer, having a random witness volunteer an alibi like that, aggressively warning us about his dirty hands, felt like a massive warning sign flashing right in our faces. Handing over that sketchy little detail without being prompted instantly painted a giant target on the fellow attorney's back. You could practically read the agonizing panic etched into his face, like he desperately needed to confess a secret but lacked the guts to spill it. Still, did that make him a murderer? That chilling mystery kept dangling over our entire squad without a solid answer. Confessing to blasting targets right before the bloodbath totally forced the squad to wonder if the partner actually pulled the trigger that night. Piling up the circumstantial clues made the lawyer look like an insanely fantastic candidate for the horrific ambush. Knocking off his boss would instantly hand him the keys to their ridiculously lucrative law firm on a silver platter. Cash frequently ends up being the primary driving force behind homicide. The exact details of who offered the cash and who actually handed it over, those technicalities just don't matter to me because cold hard cash pushes people to take lives. Investigator Cordero Stutz pushes Teddy for more details, yet his responses just make the whole situation even more confusing. The guy mentioned that he was actually having a phone conversation with Susan. He claimed to hear a massive pop that sounded like gunfire before the line completely dropped, and his repeated attempts to call her back went completely unanswered. Eventually, he figured the smartest move would be heading straight back to their place to check on their safety. Upon arriving at the property, law enforcement had already secured the perimeter with crime scene tape, completely blocking his access to the front door. The squad focuses on why Teddy was chatting with his business associate's wife at such a late hour, since the whole thing seemed incredibly sketchy. Considering they had just been at the same gathering, you would expect any work-related discussions to have wrapped up while they were still hanging out together. We desperately needed to figure out why Susan Sutton felt it was so crucial to speak with him in the middle of the night. Susan's tragic fate definitely seemed to leave Teddy completely shaken up. The man was a nervous wreck, and my intuition was screaming that he was hiding something huge from us. Detective work is partially about gathering concrete evidence, yet it heavily relies on your street smarts and that instinctual feeling people like to call your gut. You start noticing these little inconsistencies that just do not sit right with you. While those red flags aren't enough to slap handcuffs on someone, they absolutely force you to keep investigating. So I touched base with the primary detective to see if we should bring him in for a polygraph exam. Lie detector tests can honestly be absolute game changers in very specific situations. First and foremost, it signals directly to the suspect sitting in the interrogation room that you are not buying their story. We might not know the exact details they are hiding, but we can tell they are full of it. So Teddy takes the exam and bombs it. He flat out fails the questions regarding his personal connection to Susan, yet he still fiercely maintains that he is totally innocent. Consequently, Corderero Stutz pivots her attention straight toward the forensic clues left behind. While showing up at the precinct for his screening, Teddy Manto casually mentions that he happens to be carrying his personal firearm. The gun was a 9mm, perfectly matching the shell casings from the crime scene, so we confiscated it for ballistics testing to see if it fired the fatal shots. As the squad patiently waits for the lab results to come back, they start interrogating other potential witnesses. They try to build a 24-hour timeline for the victim, because in this line of work, you always want to speak with anyone who knows what went down right before the tragedy. Piecing together the exact sequence of events from that evening became an absolute top priority. Chris Sutton and his significant other, Juliet Driscoll, happened to be hanging out at the residence that same evening. I discovered they enjoyed a family dinner there around 7 o'clock at night before the young couple headed out to catch a flick at 9. While the task force worked relentlessly to verify the young couple's whereabouts, they simultaneously started digging into the complicated background of the Sutton household. It turned out that Christopher's biological mom gave birth to him at just 15 years old, leading to his early adoption. After struggling to conceive naturally, they decided to adopt a baby, and the new mother was absolutely over the moon. Raising him through his baby and toddler years genuinely brought her the greatest joy imaginable. However, things took a dark turn once Chris hit puberty, transforming him into an incredibly difficult and rebellious teenager. The kid constantly rebelled against their rules and started clashing with his parents on a daily basis. He was practically a magnet for trouble. So when he turned 17, Susan finally told John that they desperately needed an intervention. The desperate parents ultimately shipped their son off to an intense disciplinary boot camp over in Samoa. They had completely run out of options, and after countless long discussions, this drastic measure felt like the only logical solution. The whole goal was to get Chris back on track, yet he kept pushing back against the notoriously harsh punishments rumored to exist there. Word on the street was that the facility heavily utilized a dreaded solitary confinement room where any minor rule violation meant getting locked up alone for hours on end, though he foolishly assumed he would be freed the second he turned 18. What he completely missed was that John Sutton legally mandated his stay until graduation, a move that left Christopher absolutely seeing red. Chris immediately popped up on our radar as a viable suspect thanks to his incredibly troubling background. The kid definitely carried some heavy baggage, constantly crossing the line and putting his folks through absolute hell over the years. However, he was nowhere near the scene when things went down, claiming he and his girl showed up at the cinema around 9:30 p.m. Taking their seats right at 10 o'clock, the pair stayed glued to the screen until the credits rolled a couple of hours later. Juliet fully backed up this narrative, swearing they caught a flick together before heading straight back to their place to crash for the night. The moment we pinpointed the exact multiplex they visited during that specific time frame, our team sprang into action. Security cameras clearly caught the young couple walking out of the building right around the stroke of midnight, with their whereabouts completely locked down. Investigators shifted gears to trace the victims' movements throughout their last 24 hours. That trail pointed directly to his booming law practice, where he recalled arriving at 9:30 to sort through his morning correspondence and carefully evaluate his active files. Folks in his inner circle described him as a fearless attorney who never hesitated to tackle absolutely any legal battle that crossed his desk. While most professionals might run for the hills, he eagerly stepped up to the plate and took on the challenges others dodged. Whenever this guy secured a courtroom victory, the resulting financial windfalls were consistently in the multi-million-dollar range. Over the course of the summer months, stretching from June through August, business was absolutely booming. His firm successfully closed multiple massive injury claims, racking up an impressive grand total nearing $4 million in overall payout. Looking closely at Thursday, August 19, which was just shortly prior to the horrific tragedy, things were running as usual. A massive payment dropped for $1,350,000, prompting his wife to send their son on a bank run. Operating in such a high-stakes environment practically guaranteed making some bitter adversaries, and he certainly had a few. He notably secured a $100,000 judgment against a specific female defendant who did not take the loss gracefully. Fueled by pure rage, she openly promised to march right into his workplace and unleash a hail of bullets. Holding an incredibly toxic grudge, this furious lady pulled out all the stops and even filed formal grievances with the State Bar Association. The animosity ran so deep that she actively wished for his demise and despised him with every fiber of her being. Authorities strongly suspected a disgruntled litigant might have hunted down the attorney and his spouse as violent payback for the lawsuit. Whenever a violent assault occurs, finding a legally documented history of death threats against the victim immediately sets off alarm bells. Law enforcement naturally treats those kinds of glaring red flags with the utmost urgency and intense scrutiny. While digging into this malicious promise of violence, the investigative team stumbled upon an incredibly alarming new clue. A local resident living nearby mentioned hearing a marine engine violently roar to life out in the dark water. Right around 10:30, this mysterious watercraft tore away from the property line at an incredibly reckless pace. With the family estate bordering a massive waterway, a neighborhood bystander clearly spotted the fleeing vessel tearing through the darkness, which we ironically discovered later, matched the exact model owned by the incredibly angry defendant. Our main priority shifted to locking down the exact location of her personal watercraft when the trigger was pulled. Assigning a seasoned cop to the task, they managed to hunt down surveillance tape proving her vessel was safely tied up at the marina during the fatal window. The evidence completely shattered the theory that the shooter used her specific ride to sneak onto the crime scene. Still, proper police work demanded a formal sit-down to definitively clear her name or keep her on the suspect list, so we brought her in. After realizing she wasn't our shooter, the squad immediately pivoted their undivided attention right back onto our original target. The highly anticipated firearms analysis had finally made its way into the hands of the lead investigator. Even though the lab confirmed his piece didn't fire the deadly rounds, he was still very much swimming in hot water. Forensics allowed us to definitively cross that specific firearm off our list of potential murder weapons. Knowing full well another 9mm could be out there, the detective pushed extremely hard to figure out his dirty little secret. The second we slammed the flunked lie detector results down on the table, his entire demeanor shifted. He caved immediately, confessing that his deceptive reading spiked because he had been carrying on a secret, years-long affair with the married victim. This shocking revelation completely blew the case wide open, handing us a classic, deeply personal reason for the slaughter. The moment he spilled the beans about the secret romance, we suddenly had the most ancient and volatile motive in human history staring us down. Tangled romantic webs almost always act as massive red flags when trying to piece together a violent homicide. Passions can easily run completely out of control when emotional expectations aren't met behind closed doors. Jealous lovers often feel deeply betrayed after buying into endless promises of a brand new life together away from their spouses. Dangling the promise of a divorce and stringing someone along for years creates explosive resentment, leaving our detectives absolutely no choice but to deeply investigate scorned lovers who finally decide to snap. Teddy claims he only made up that story in the beginning because he was trying to protect Susan's reputation. At this stage, she's already passed away, and absolutely nothing can change that sad reality. He figured if he could just hide the truth from her loved ones, her kids, and her husband about the secret fling she was having, he was totally willing to take that risk. Teddy insisted he was chilling at his place when the shooting went down, just talking to Susan on the phone. By digging into the cellular records, we managed to completely back up his story and confirm he was indeed chatting with her from his own house, which was located a few miles down the road from where the whole nightmare took place. Teddy is eventually cleared of all suspicion, but his confession completely crushes his friend and coworker. I honestly felt like I was totally stabbed in the back. It felt like I was being played for a fool, and I honestly believed I was being lied to from every single angle. Honestly, it just felt like another massive headache thrown onto an already gigantic pile of disasters. The pool of potential suspects suddenly drops to absolutely zero, leaving John incredibly frustrated and angry. I was definitely a huge pain in the neck as a victim because I was constantly demanding, where are those police reports? I need to see those case files right now. What exactly is happening and who is handling all of this? What's the status of this investigation? And honestly, the cops were giving me absolutely nothing to work with. You really have to look at the big picture when you're dealing with a murder case like this. It goes way beyond just tracking down the bad guy who actually pulled the trigger. It's about looking at someone and saying they might have had reasons A, B, C, and D to do it, but they didn't actually commit the act. It takes a massive amount of effort, but you completely have to leave no stone unturned. Several weeks deep into digging around, all that hard work finally pays off when the investigators spot a massive red flag. My specific job was to go through and pull all the contact logs linked to the Sutton family, including John and Susan, Chris Sutton, Julia Driscoll, and Teddy Monto. What really jumped off the page were the call logs connected directly to Christopher Sutton. As it turns out, there was a really clear pattern of incoming and outgoing calls stretching over a few weeks, leading right up to the evening of the attack. 162 calls were made between July 19th and August 23rd. The very last of those calls happens right around midnight on the night of the killing, and the whole thing is actually caught on tape. The guy probably made it about 50 to 100 feet past the exit doors before he instantly whips out his cell to make a call. The one detail that really grabbed my eye while I was reviewing the surveillance footage was the fact that the second Chris steps out of that movie theater, he's already grabbing his cell, punching in a number, and putting it up to his ear, while Juliet is just kind of trailing a few steps behind him, looking like she's struggling to keep up with his pace. You'd honestly expect that after seeing a flick with your future wife, you'd be walking hand in hand with her, asking her what her thoughts were on the film, instead of instantly blowing her off to ring somebody else up. We eventually figured out that the person on the other end of that specific call was a guy named Garrett Kopp. He was just a kid, probably somewhere around 19 or 20 years old. We also found out he had a girlfriend, and they shared a kid together. His rap sheet included a history of burglary, along with some low-level drug dealing charges from his past. He totally looked like a total deadbeat, heading nowhere fast. Cop just seems like your average street thug until the cops stumble onto a major clue from his latest arrest, learning he got busted by the Homestead Police Department just a day after the hit went down. And for context, Homestead sits about 18 to 20 miles straight south of Coral Gables. That was the exact moment when Art and I just looked at each other and thought, holy cow. Being in this line of work, I absolutely refuse to believe in random chance. When you're working a murder case, coincidences simply don't exist. Everything happens for a very specific reason. So I picked up the receiver and rang up the Homestead Police Department. I straight up asked the guy, please tell me this arrest was for some kind of violent attack. And he goes, yeah, it actually was. I told him, you've got to tell me there was a firearm tied to this. And he replied, yeah, a gun was definitely in the mix. So I followed up with, please say it was a Glock. He confirms, yeah, it was a 9mm Glock, to which I said, now for the love of God, tell me you still have that piece in evidence. And he goes, I sure do. Detective Larry Ballew's instincts are screaming at him that he might have just tracked down the exact firearm used to take out Susan Sutton. Right then and there, we drove down to grab that pistol from Homestead and handed it straight over to our ballistics expert, who completely matched the piece to the bullet fragments pulled from Susan's body and the scene, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was the weapon used to murder Susan and shoot John Sutton. Garrett Kopp instantly turns into the single most crucial piece of the puzzle in our entire operation, and we suddenly had to shift all our focus into digging up every little detail about this guy. Even with this massive bombshell dropping, Bello is taking his sweet time and isn't rushing to haul Kopp into the interrogation room. We obviously knew we had the murder weapon in custody, and we had Garrett Kopp, the guy allegedly holding the piece, but we needed to make sure our case was absolutely bulletproof first. If we dragged him in right then, he could just shrug and say, hey, I just bought this piece from a buddy, and that would literally be his entire defense. Bottom line is, we couldn't definitively prove he pulled the trigger yet, so we spent that time beefing up the file by interviewing a bunch of other witnesses. And sitting right at the very top of that interview list is Christopher Sutton. My orders were simply to conduct a standard questioning session. During our chat regarding the accomplice, Christopher merely brushed him off as a professional contact, prompting me to press him on what exactly he meant by that phrase. The suspect explained that he brought the guy over to his folks' place just to handle a handful of random chores. He refused to offer any real specifics about the exact nature of those weird tasks, minus a single glaring exception, namely that following the mother's homicide and the brutal attack on the dad, he hired his buddy to rip up the flooring straight out of the primary suite where the patriarch took the bullet. However, mentioning that specific name to other witnesses quickly paints an entirely contradictory narrative. My primary focus for that specific phase of the investigation landed squarely on the father. I finally got the chance to sit down with the survivor once he was discharged from the medical center and resting up back at his residence. The older man revealed that the two young guys were actually incredibly tight buddies, spending countless hours chilling side by side on a regular basis. He confirmed the kid had definitely stepped foot inside their residence previously, likely on several separate occasions. It was already on my radar that the kid had quit his classes, and I fully knew my boy was constantly running around town with him. From what I could gather, the guy lacked a steady job and acted like a total loser, making it crystal clear that this friendship was an incredibly toxic influence on my son. My gut kept telling me my kid was messing around with narcotics, though I honestly lacked a single shred of hard evidence to back up that theory. Once law enforcement begins scratching beneath the surface, the father's darkest instincts are absolutely validated. Detectives uncovered that the pair actively discussed moving narcotics with the son actually fronting his buddy a stash to push, just so the deadbeat could keep a little extra cash on hand. That revelation instantly cracked the case wide open with a fresh angle, especially since we knew the accomplice was already familiar with the property. Taking on those random household chores meant he had already memorized every single inch of the floor plan. Therefore, sitting in the detective's chair, you are forced to figure out exactly what kind of payoff or advantage this kid stood to walk away with. We had to wonder if the shooter acted alone, figuring out the family had valuables to pawn or a stash to steal, prompting him to break in and score a quick high. It became crucial for the team to entertain the idea that this suspect could have masterminded the entire brutal bloodbath without any outside help. The local judge had already slapped him with an active apprehension order for a completely unrelated charge. So upon his capture, I told my squad, haul him directly to my desk, which is exactly when we launched into the intense interrogation surrounding the double homicide. Please clearly announce your full legal identity for the recording tape, which he immediately confirmed as Garrett Kopp. Throughout the lengthy interrogation, I was secretly stockpiling leverage that I could later use to dismantle his story, because running a successful questioning session relies entirely on creative instinct rather than rigid formulas. Honestly, it really just boils down to your years on the job. Whenever you sit across from a suspect, your eyes are constantly searching for involuntary physical cues, very much akin to trying to read a bluffer's nervous tics during a high-stakes casino tournament. An expert detective spots those subtle leaks in real time, like when the kid tried claiming the firearm recovered from the scene absolutely did not belong to him, insisting it was actually owned by a third party. A predictable excuse I fully expected him to throw right at my face. Regardless, the moment a guilty person attempts to bury the truth, they inevitably begin weaving a web of seemingly harmless falsehoods. But the fundamental reality remains that piling up those tiny deceptions will absolutely cause you to stumble over your own words before the night finishes. One of the primary angles I pushed during our chat was trying to gauge the exact depth of his friendship with the son. I asked him the duration of their bond, to which he casually replied it spanned roughly 6 or 7 years. When questioned on their initial introduction, he claimed they shared a residential block, prompting me to demand the specific location. He named a local complex, and upon further pressing, specified it sat directly on Sunset and 72nd Avenue. After I asked if they chatted on a daily basis, he vehemently denied it, a massive fabrication we immediately saw through thanks to a stack of cellular billing statements sitting right on my desk. The guy then tried to establish an alibi by claiming he spent that entire fatal evening wrapped up with his romantic partner. Since his partner was literally chilling out in our front reception area, I leaned in and confidently declared that she was next on my list the second we finished up. That aggressive move made him realize he was completely boxed in, fully aware we had already busted him on multiple pathetic fabrications. Reaching a breaking point roughly 3 to 5 grueling hours into the session, he completely cracked, finally confessing that his buddy actually orchestrated the whole hit. I immediately fired back, demanding a motive, asking if either parent had ever crossed him, shown him disrespect, or treated him like absolute garbage in the past. After confirming the victims had never caused him an ounce of pain, the dam burst, and he spilled the terrifying secret that the son explicitly ordered the execution. The suspect chillingly added that refusing the deadly contract would have resulted in his supposed friend slaughtering both him and his infant child without a second thought. Following an absolutely exhausting interrogation marathon, the cornered suspect ultimately confesses to firing the fatal shots that destroyed the parents' lives. When pushed on why he gunned down the couple, he claimed his fate rested entirely with his friend, terrified by a direct threat against his little boy's survival, as well as his own life. Hearing cop pin the entire hit on Christopher, the victim's own son, blew this investigation wide open. It became crystal clear right then that Garrett Kopp was heading straight to prison for capital murder. From that moment forward, our primary objective shifted completely to putting together an airtight file on Christopher. The team needed to corroborate the hitman's confession quietly without tipping off their prime suspect. The obvious weak link in the chain was his long-term girlfriend, Juliet Driscoll. Those two were practically inseparable after years of being together, so there was absolutely no way she was in the dark. We dragged her down to the station, and I grilled her for a solid 10 or 11 hours straight while she just stonewalled me the entire time. She just kept insisting that she was clueless about the hit and that her boyfriend kept his thoughts completely to himself. I desperately needed leverage to break through her defenses, and then a sudden thought hit me. She had an incredibly tight bond with the victim, so I decided to use Susan's kindness as an emotional wedge. I reminded her that the murdered woman treated her like a daughter, expressing my disgust that she would just sit there and protect the killer when that entire household had treated her like family. Reminding her about the job they provided finally cracked her armor, and the moment a single tear dropped, I knew she was ready to talk. That was the exact turning point where she spilled everything she had been hiding about her boyfriend. It turned out he harbored a deep resentment over being shipped off to reform school and constantly fantasized about making his folks suffer. Whenever his temper flared up, he would openly talk about wanting to end their lives. He would claim they needed to be dead, yet that lingering grudge was years old, leaving us wondering what finally pushed him over the edge. The missing puzzle piece fell into place when we discovered the massive multi-million-dollar lawsuit settlement that the son had personally deposited for his dad. Pure greed took over, and his deep-seated bitterness finally merged with a desperate craving for that massive payout. That confession handed me the exact probable cause I needed to secure a warrant and lock the kid up. Once the fugitive was in custody, they dragged him into the interrogation room where I formally introduced myself. I laid it out plain and simple, explaining that while I would be sleeping in my own bed, he would be spending the night behind bars for a brutal homicide. I made it perfectly clear that his fate was sealed, warning him that I already held all the cards before he even opened his mouth. Dropping his girlfriend's name and mentioning her official confession caught him off guard, prompting him to demand physical proof. Skimming through just a few paragraphs of her testimony utterly broke him, and he just buried his face in the desk while sobbing hysterically. The mastermind officially faced capital charges for slaughtering his mom and desperately trying to eliminate his dad. Living with the sting of such an unimaginable betrayal is agonizing, almost as much as the physical torture of surviving gunshot wounds to the skull. This was a chillingly calculated execution, a completely irreversible nightmare that leaves scars time can never heal. The trauma lingers forever, especially when the investigators laid out the precise 24-hour window detailing how the son orchestrated the slaughter of his own family. The grand scheme started with the kid securing a firearm for the hit. He then handed the weapon over to his buddy, providing a step-by-step blueprint on breaching the property and locating his sleeping targets. The instructions even detailed their separate sleeping arrangements, pointing the assassin straight toward the rear quarters to complete the bloody task. When the fateful evening finally arrived, everything was already set in motion. The whole crew gathered at the residence for a festive meal around 7 o'clock in the evening, with the mastermind and his girlfriend sitting right at the table. Both parents enjoyed the company of their guest, sharing a wonderful feast and slicing into a celebratory birthday cake. Fast forward to roughly 9 o'clock at night, the young couple supposedly dipped out to catch a film at the theater. The final guest headed out near 9:30 in the evening, leaving the homeowners to retreat to their separate quarters right around 10 o'clock at night. Phone records confirm that the departed guest gave the mother a quick call just moments after arriving home. They were deep in conversation, with him using his home line while she chatted on her mobile device. While that conversation was happening, the hired gun quietly slipped through the backyard patio doors. The intruder prowled silently across the entire length of the property, ambushing his defenseless victims in their private spaces and opening fire. Minutes later, the triggerman dialed up his boss to confidently confirm that the brutal massacre was finally finished. Pinning down that exact sequence of events was utterly crucial, because laying out the facts makes the entire bloody conspiracy obvious to absolutely anyone paying attention. Our investigative team had officially flipped the script on this horrific tragedy to focus on the future instead of dwelling on the past. So I just locked those dark memories away in the back of my mind. The pain constantly lingers and surfaces more than it should, leaving me endlessly wondering if I missed some crucial warning sign. The truth is that I was completely powerless to stop it, because Christopher spent literal years hunting down the perfect hitman to slaughter his family. He ultimately discovered his willing executioner in Garrett Kopp, leading to an incredibly calculated and cold-blooded hit. This crime scene looked exactly like a targeted mob hit, showing absolutely zero compassion for the victim. Vital clues necessary to break the whole thing wide open. Only by piecing those fragments together can investigators finally capture the dangerous perpetrator. Welcome to Greenwich, Connecticut, an incredibly wealthy paradise nestled right here in the States. The entire neighborhood radiates pure opulence, meaning you absolutely need a multi-million-dollar trust fund just to get your foot in the door. You can barely see the horizon past all the massive, breathtaking private estates. Famous movie stars and corporate executives flood the pristine streets, yet all that cash simply cannot buy invincibility. Relocation workers stumbled upon Andrew Kissel's corpse after helping him pack up over the weekend and returning to finish the job bright and early Monday. The team repeatedly pounded on the front entryway with zero response, eventually turning the handle only to find it completely unsecured. A worker casually headed downstairs to the cellar to grab some leftover boxes. What happened during the final 24 hours of Andrew Clay's life is absolutely crucial for investigators trying to crack this homicide case. The investigation kicks off by estimating when he passed away, using the posture of the corpse and the blood pooling patterns to figure out roughly how much time has slipped by since the incident. Teaming up with the local coroner allows law enforcement to narrow down that fatal time frame with a solid amount of accuracy. Sunday definitely marks the day Andrew Kissel lost his life, and all signs point toward the attack taking place sometime after the sun went down. As cops piece together the crime scene puzzle, one glaring fact stands out, because absolutely zero signs of forced entry exist around the property. Nobody smashed a window or kicked down a door, meaning the victim clearly welcomed his own killer right straight into the residence. The primary three things popping into my mind were the reasons behind his solitude, the exact duration of his isolation, and the identities of anyone aware of his vulnerable state. The timing of everyone packing up and leaving right before the solitary resident gets slaughtered feels insanely suspicious, raising massive red flags for our entire team. They've fallen behind on their leasing obligations, facing a looming eviction from their gorgeous $10,000 a month estate tucked away in rural Greenwich. Perfectly explained why the hauling company was on site. His funds were drying up, his mood was utterly toxic, and she explicitly accused him of battling severe narcotics habits, heavy drinking, and serious domestic aggression. His shady behavior was practically an open secret to her, considering she frequently busted him hooking up assets without breathing a word to his partners, pocketing every last cent of the profits for himself. Those financial backers fully expected regular payout checks, yet he just kept draining their bank accounts dry instead. I clearly recall Pat comparing Andrew to a smaller version of Bernie Madoff. The riders all of whom carried their own protective policies anyway. As for the private citizens who got swindled, we discovered most of them were just wealthy seniors living their twilight years. Those folks simply lacked the capacity. His boss as being in shockingly high spirits. Sure, the looming prison sentence weighed heavily on his mind, but overall, he seemed pretty chill. After that brief hangout, the assistant swore he walked out the front door and drove straight back to his home in Bridgeport. Carlos informed our team he took off around 6 p.m. that night, right before the moving crew was scheduled to arrive bright and early the next day. That essentially made him the final individual known to have crossed paths with Andrew before the murder. This detail was absolutely crucial to our investigation. Tracking down and questioning whoever last saw the victim breathing is a game changer in any homicide, since it helps paint a clear picture of the victim's final moments. Did they seem terrified, mention anything out of the ordinary to their companion, or stumble upon some dangerous information? The guy constantly repeated how much he cared for Andrew, stressing a deep platonic bond rather than anything romantic. He laid it on pretty thick, trying to prove his loyalty and admiration for the victim, all while anxiously repeating that he needed to leave. After he insisted he was in a rush multiple times, we had no choice but to cut him loose, which definitely left us exchanging suspicious glances. We thought it was weird, because if your best friend dies, you would normally stick around and do whatever possible to help the cops find the killer. Instead, he fed us a bunch of excuses to dodge our questions, leaving us wondering what he was hiding. Further digging revealed their supposed friendship was actually incredibly one-sided, with Andrew essentially treating him like an errand boy. We even uncovered an incident where the boss called him up on a rare day off, demanding he report to work immediately. The poor guy abandoned his family and drove 30 to 40 minutes to Greenwich, only to find out he was just needed for a junk food run. That glaring lack of respect really stood out to us. It completely contradicted the suspect's earlier claims about sharing a tight father-son style bond with the victim, making the whole dynamic feel incredibly sketchy. All these conflicting details made his story look weaker by the minute. Nothing he told us matched reality, which was a massive red flag. His bizarrely hasty departure during the initial sit-down only fueled our suspicions, prompting us to drag him back into the interrogation room 7 days later. During round 2, he suddenly had an overly intricate timeline ready to go. He claimed his crew eventually returned to Bridgeport, but only after he personally checked out from Andrew's place at 6 o'clock. From there, he supposedly cruised down to Queens, hit up a local tavern, socialized with a massive crowd, and spent hours tearing up the dance floor. He swore the venue was absolutely packed to the brim that night. When pressed for more specifics, he vaguely mentioned throwing back a few drinks before finally calling it quits. The suspect insisted he hit the road back home in the wee hours of Sunday, grabbing some late-night takeout for his partner around 1 a.m. If true, this timeline would clear his name by proving he was nowhere near the murder site when the attack went down. We executed warrants on both his residence and his ride, but the search turned up absolutely zero hard evidence. Taking a random trip down to Queens and heading back out wasn't inherently suspicious. At first glance, that specific detour didn't exactly set off our alarm bells. Fortunately, his reported route gave our squad a solid way to poke holes in his narrative. The Easy Pass transponder essentially acts as a prepaid ticket, allowing drivers to breeze right past toll booths without ever having to hand over cash. Every time a car glides through the scanner, the system logs the entry and frequently snaps a license plate photo for good measure. We wasted no time getting a judge to sign off on a subpoena for that tracking data. The documents confirm part of his alibi, proving he definitely crossed the Bronx-Whitestone Bridge just like he claimed. The glaring issue was the complete lack of any electronic footprint proving he ever made the trip back. When we grilled him about the missing data, he conveniently claimed he misplaced his transponder somewhere in his ride and was forced to pay cash. We desperately needed to nail down his exact movements from the second he stepped off the victim's property. Pinning down his exact route from Queens all the way back up to Bridgeport was a top priority. Leaving no stone unturned was mandatory, considering this was the most high-profile murder we had seen in a century. It was the kind of massive investigation that defines a cop's entire career. Verifying his story meant sacrificing someone to sit through endless security footage, a brutal task that naturally fell to our rookie, Pierre. Shoving all the tedious grunt work onto the newbie is practically tradition, especially back then when we were stuck rewinding bulky VHS cassettes instead of clicking through digital files. He got stuck in a tiny viewing closet, staring at a massive plastic crate stuffed to the brim with transit authority tape. Staring at those grainy monitors for days on end probably did permanent damage to his eyesight. While Detective Corticelli was busy going blind watching tape, the rest of the crew stumbled onto a brand new person of interest, Eric Boxerman. This new guy wasn't just a close buddy of the victim, they were also heavily entangled in the construction world through his gig as a real estate financier. The guy was an absolute staple of the local high society scene, always popping up in the pages of Greenwich magazine at every exclusive party around the city. During his interrogation, Boxerman seemed completely transparent about what went down that afternoon. He willingly answered questions without ever demanding a lawyer, walking us through his timeline at 11 o'clock that Sunday morning. Upon arriving at the residence, he noticed the victim sitting there entirely alone and heavily intoxicated. He informed the detectives that the victim was passed out on the sofa in a total stupor, perfectly illustrating the man's chaotic mental state. Authorities then pressed him to detail exactly where he was during the precise time frame of the murder. His claim was that he spent the entire evening at his own place, conveniently located just down the street. We pushed him further to see if he had spoken to a single soul or noticed anyone passing by. Spotting a woman strolling with her dog was his only alibi, which definitely left us feeling a bit suspicious. Anyone who interacts with a victim on the very day they lose their life automatically lands on the radar. That timeline instantly places you in the prime position to be the one who committed the crime. Since his story could not be firmly corroborated, investigators started peeling back the layers of his dynamic with the couple. It did not take long to discover that his bond with the wife crossed the line far beyond mere platonic buddies. Whenever the husband would head out to work, this secret lover was quietly sneaking right into the picture. Being the last face a dead man saw while actively sleeping with his spouse practically guarantees you the top spot on the suspect list. Love triangles are incredibly explosive setups, making it impossible to predict what someone might do in the heat of the moment. While some people break down in tears, others resort to bloodshed, and exposing this forbidden affair suddenly unleashed a very weird local theory. A shocking story suddenly broke across the local broadcast regarding Andrew. The wild theory claimed he ended his own life just to play the hero and secure a $15 million insurance payout for his children. Reporters ran wild with the crazy idea that the whole thing was actually a contracted hit orchestrated by the victim himself. Why on earth would anyone opt for such an agonizingly brutal exit, letting themselves be tied up and repeatedly slashed in a dark cellar? People taking that route usually choose a much easier method, especially since our entire psychological profile showed the guy cared only about himself. The man was the absolute definition of a textbook egomaniac, making the sacrificial concept sound utterly absurd to our team. The fascinating part was watching News 12 break that narrative first, supposedly relying on some anonymous caller hitting up their hotline. Our lead investigators somehow managed to trace those digits straight back to the original mystery caller. That specific mobile device was registered directly under Eric Boxerman's name. Did he plant that fabricated narrative to deflect heat away from his secret girlfriend? Or was something even more sinister driving him? Lacking clear answers, our focus completely locked onto him, as that single media leak suddenly thrust him into the center of a homicide investigation. Finding his personal line linked to this bizarre tale of a staged assassination was undeniably suspicious. The squad carefully balanced the potential rewards of the crime against the massive life he stood to forfeit. The guy was incredibly wealthy, living out of a massive $13 million estate rather than some basic suburban starter house. Being a highly accomplished executive, secretly sleeping with the grieving widow certainly kept our investigative radars on high alert. However, stepping out on a marriage with someone does not automatically transform you into a cold-blooded killer. Nothing about the bloody basement suggested an emotional lover's quarrel, as the execution felt incredibly calculated and contracted. With zero history of violence and absolutely no physical evidence tying him to the house, that angle completely dried up. We found absolutely zero red flags suggesting he possessed the dark capability to end another human being's life. His little media stunt definitely threw a curveball into the investigation and left the entire precinct scratching our heads. Once he was cleared as a suspect, we hit a massive brick wall, exhausting every lead and interviewing everyone without gaining a single inch of ground. The momentum vanished completely, turning it into a cold file right as one of our veteran detectives decided to hang up his hat. Reaching the end of my own career, I sat down with my partner and admitted it was finally time to step away. He promised me he would see the investigation through to the bitter end, ultimately pulling a fresh detective into the fold. Passing my shield down to him felt like a powerful passing of the torch, especially since we had already burned through roughly 25 to 30 legal warrants. Solving a massive puzzle like this requires serious pavement pounding rather than just chilling at your desk praying for a lucky break. Leaving no stone unturned meant constantly traveling, practically abandoning our personal lives just to chase down every single phantom lead. Things got so extreme that we used to laugh about accidentally throwing our own spouses into a police lineup just to see their faces. It had been ages since we crossed paths, so recognizing their faces in a crowd was highly unlikely. We basically lived together during that period, constantly brainstorming and pushing ourselves to the absolute limit just to crack this mystery. Reporters were practically breathing down our necks, demanding answers and expecting the department to close the investigation immediately. Driven mad by the slow pace of those early months, the victim's dad actually fired off a furious message labeling our squad a bunch of bumbling fools. That remark definitely stung the crew deeply, especially since everyone had been pulling all-nighters for this exact investigation. My partner actually printed out a massive copy of that harsh message and slapped it right onto the center of his desk wall. It served as the ultimate fuel, motivating him to prove to the grieving parent that our dedication was absolute and we were determined to throw everything we had into finding the truth. Following endless days spent staring at security tapes, the lead investigator finally stumbles upon a massive game-changing clue. My phone rang with him, shouting that he nailed the suspect, which left me utterly speechless. Seeing the snapshot was mind-blowing because it perfectly captured our main target, casually driving right through the toll booth. The camera setup in that spot produced an incredibly crisp image that captured every single detail of his face perfectly. The footage proved the suspect was heading directly back over the water into our state. This arrival happened way earlier than his original story claimed, landing him in town right before the fatal incident and totally destroying his fake alibi. That single revelation forced our entire team to go back and re-examine every single piece of evidence from scratch. My partner and I camped out at the federal headquarters in New York, digging deep into their massive storage vault specifically dedicated to all the physical proof from this complex tragedy. We meticulously scoured through roughly 25 or 26 massive storage cartons packed to the brim with paperwork. On the surface, the suspect lacked any clear motivation for wanting his wealthy employer taken out of the picture. Slowly but surely, law enforcement figured out that this guy was way more than a simple chauffeur. He was actually a key player in the victim's shady real estate scams, moving cash around alongside his very own sibling. That sibling controlled the legal paperwork for countless sketchy property flips, while the suspect's romantic partner was also deeply entangled in the mess. His girlfriend literally cooked the books for the victim's massive financial crimes, making her a crucial piece of the overall puzzle. Looking at their lineage was like staring at a mafia syndicate, with every single relative seemingly involved in some kind of felony. The real reason behind the tragic setup eventually became crystal clear, since the boss was preparing to confess to his own crimes. Facing major prison time, the disgraced businessman could easily have exposed his accomplices. Naturally, the individuals facing the greatest risk of federal prosecution were the driver and his entire criminal clan. Anyone tied to those under-the-table financial operations was staring down the barrel of a massive criminal indictment. The circumstantial connections were incredibly strong, yet the squad desperately needed hard facts, proving a sinister plot, leading them to meticulously tear through the suspect's personal belongings. Our search turned up multiple stolen plastic payments, including a bank card belonging to a previously unknown female relative. Curious about this new name, we ran her information and located her residence exactly 57 miles north of the original crime scene. I immediately told my partner to start the car so we could take a road trip up there right away. Tracking down this mystery woman was essential because stirring up trouble and shaking the trees is exactly how we crack tough cases. This new city was incredibly rough around the edges, entirely lacking the glamorous wealth of the victim's posh hometown. The streets were filled with gritty, hardworking folks just scraping by and doing whatever they could to earn an honest living. Marching straight up to her residence, we hammered loudly on the rear entrance of the building. A voice shouted down from the upstairs window, prompting me to flash my badge and announce our official presence. She eventually stepped outside, and the second I flashed a photograph of our main suspect, she quickly identified him as family. Once she admitted their connection, I dropped the bomb that we were actively investigating some serious foul play. Without missing a beat, she casually asked if we were looking into the wealthy guy who recently met a grim fate. Stumbling upon this relative yielded an absolute goldmine of information, leaving my partner wide-eyed and ready for the wild ride. Recognizing a massive breakthrough, I immediately urged her to spill every single detail she knew. She confessed that during an Independence Day cookout last year, the main suspect actually approached her stepbrother with a massive cash offer to do the ultimate dirty work for him. Apparently, the suspect had pocketed $500,000 from his employer, and silencing him permanently was the only way to keep the cash. The rumor mill was also spinning with wild theories, including a bizarre claim that the ailing victim practically begged to check out early on his own terms. Despite the crazy gossip, the truth clearly pointed to the driver orchestrating the whole tragic setup, forcing the squad to hunt down the stepbrother. Knowing the truth is only half the battle because securing a conviction means gathering rock-solid evidence for the courtroom. Believe it or not, Lenny was just a totally clueless guy residing in Worcester, Massachusetts. He had just welcomed a new baby, and we desperately needed him to spill every single detail about his interactions with Carlos. So we applied some heavy pressure, and Lenny Trujillo confessed that Carlos had reached out with a wild story about his boss. Apparently, this wealthy Greenwich resident wanted out of this world, offering serious cash and a computer to whoever would assist him. The suspect was remarkably eager to talk, claiming his only real intention was to hustle Carlos out of his cash. His master plan was simply to squeeze out as many dollars as possible and then walk away clean. Eventually, Lenny confessed that the two of them spent countless hours mapping out the entire illicit scheme. They spent 6 to 8 months brewing this up, linking at highway rest stops and parking lots where Carlos handed over the funds. They just kept refining the dark plot over and over, and Lenny even revealed that Carlos covered his stay at a local hotel. Sure enough, we dug up the credit card receipts with both of their signatures, proving Carlos footed the bill for Lenny's room. When the very next morning finally rolled around, the pair drove straight down to Greenwich, and he accurately detailed the specific layout and various shops around the town. There was absolutely no way a random guy from Worcester, Massachusetts could have just imagined those hyper-specific details. All the evidence pointed squarely at a massive conspiracy between Lenny and Carlos to pull off this horrific act. He claimed the strategy was to restrain the target, move him to the cellar, and use a blade on him, which proved crucial. Because of those exact details, we instantly knew he was being completely truthful about that particular chapter of the saga. Lenny spilled about 90% of the story, but stubbornly refused to admit he was present when Andrew actually lost his life. Even though we never secured a completely straightforward confession from him, we had gathered more than enough puzzle pieces to clearly illustrate the chaos leading up to Andrew Kissel's tragic end. Honestly, mapping out the timeline is absolutely critical to understanding everything that unfolded on that final day. During his only day off on a Sunday, Carlos made a surprise trek down to Greenwich under the guise of paying a friendly visit. He played it off like he was merely checking in on his old buddy Andrew. After parting ways, records show he hopped onto Interstate 95 toward New York and completely powered down his device. He used an electronic toll pass over the Whitestone Bridge, then paid cash to cross back into the Bronx less than 2 hours later. That effectively meant Carlos circled right back to Greenwich, Connecticut, with Lenny riding shotgun. Since they were familiar faces, Andrew casually invited them inside, and they likely sat around sharing a few drinks. They definitely partook in some party powders, and eventually they managed to guide him down into the subterranean level. They silenced and restrained him down there, executing the dark plan exactly how Lenny had outlined it to us earlier. They forced him to the floor and ensured the entire grim ordeal was kept absolutely silent. I picture them restraining him single-handedly while driving a blade deep into him 5 times, landing 3 utterly fatal blows. 2 strikes hit the aorta and 1 struck the carotid artery, after which we suspect they swiftly fled the residence. Carlos probably shuttled Lenny back to his place before retreating to his own spot in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Feeling rock solid about the evidence, Detectives Aerfino and Corticelli went completely on the hunt for Carlos. We spotted him operating a limousine a few towns over, pulled the vehicle over, and I strolled right up alongside Pierre. I asked if he remembered me and told him his time was officially up, booking him for the ultimate crime. For the takedown of both guys, the squad actually used the vintage handcuffs I was issued way back in 1965. They slapped my old cuffs on those 2 lowlifes, eventually mounting the restraints on a wooden plaque as a gift for me. I still proudly display that trophy at my house, and it is absolutely fantastic. On April 15th, 2011, Lenny Trujillo was handed a solid 20-year stretch behind bars. Carlos took a plea deal, serving just 6 years before facing deportation to Colombia, which left me feeling incredibly shortchanged. As an immigrant myself, the realization hit me pretty hard when I learned he was being permanently kicked out of the country. I cherish my roots, but I'd never want to move back, so knowing he could never return to American soil was huge. That banishment was basically a life sentence of its own, while his brother George also headed back to Colombia. Andrew Kissel's accountant, Stella Torr, seemingly vanished into thin air, and her ultimate fate remains a complete mystery. Cash ruled everything in Andrew Kissel's world, which is exactly what dragged him into that fatal predicament in the first place. The guy made off with $42 million and was deep in debt to some dangerous folks, yet nobody deserves to be fatally stabbed in that brutal manner. Ultimately, solid detective work always brings the hidden facts out into the light. We poured our absolute souls into this grueling investigation, and the truth finally emerged. The sound of a lady crying out that someone had died echoed through the air, signaling an absolutely savage murder. The victim was deliberately restrained and tied up with clear intent, plunging us into a deeply sinister puzzle involving several potential culprits. This particular individual genuinely believed he possessed superior intelligence compared to the rest of the room, even threatening to murder anyone who leaked his secret. Reality always catches up eventually, despite his arrogant assumption that he could completely escape the consequences of his horrendous actions. It breaks my heart to imagine how desperately that defenseless lady must have pleaded for mercy. Thinking about those horrifying final moments absolutely makes my blood run cold. Across the North American continent, countless lives are tragically cut short by homicide on a daily basis. Cracking the most baffling murder cases requires investigators to meticulously piece together the last 24 hours of the victim's existence. Every single minute leading up to the tragedy holds crucial clues needed to unravel the puzzle. Ultimately, tracing those final footsteps is exactly what empowers law enforcement to bring a ruthless criminal to justice. The gorgeous Merritt Island Peninsula in Florida sits perfectly tucked away between the flowing Indian River and the vast Atlantic Ocean. Endless streams of vacationers visit our community for its famous aquatic activities, since the entire region is practically engulfed by the sea. Despite the abundance of bustling fishing vessels and recreational boating, the local vibe remains incredibly relaxed and easygoing. Our hidden coastal paradise genuinely offers one of the most breathtakingly picturesque environments you could ever call home. However, a scorching summer afternoon in July brought a horrifying discovery when a local magistrate stumbled upon something sinister while tending to his garden. From a distance, the shadowy figure floating in the water looked exactly like a common sea cow. Approaching the water's edge quickly shattered that illusion as he recognized a female corpse, prompting an immediate call to law enforcement that ultimately landed on my desk. Detectives Jerry Harrell and Allie Roberts from the Brevard County Sheriff's Department promptly pulled up to the secured crime scene. Staring down at the fresh remains of an unidentified woman is undeniably one of the worst moments you can experience as a murder investigator. The victim's remains were already showing significant signs of natural decay. Gases had severely expanded her features to roughly double their natural proportions, though the internal pressure had not completely ruptured yet. Heavy cords and heavy-duty adhesive tape restricted her movements, while several plastic grocery sacks were deliberately fastened around her form. Securing a conviction heavily depends on the team's ability to perfectly trace where the victim spent her final 24 hours. Mapping out a deceased individual's final steps is absolutely paramount to the investigation, though the immediate hurdle involves simply figuring out her name. All we initially had was the unidentifiable corpse of a Caucasian woman with absolutely zero clues pointing to her actual background. Securing an identity finally allows detectives to dive deep into the victim's history and thoroughly analyze their personal life. We desperately needed to uncover her professional career, her daily routines, and the exact social circles she regularly interacted with. A specialized forensics technician immediately stepped in to lift viable identifying marks from the deceased woman's hands. The prints matched a 22-year-old Indian Harbor Beach resident named Misty Morris, a hometown native who resided right down the street alongside her mom. This breakthrough gave me massive hope, since perpetrators generally have close ties to their targets, providing a much clearer investigative path compared to chasing random drifters. The squad immediately shifted their focus toward calculating her exact submersion time, which significantly complicates pinpointing the precise moment she passed away. Factoring in the surrounding aquatic climate becomes an absolutely mandatory variable for accurate forensic calculations. Aquatic environments frequently supercharge the natural deterioration process, breaking down organic tissue much faster than dry land or chilly weather ever could. Sweltering summer temperatures in Florida create a brutally warm environment teeming with aggressive wildlife and relentless bug activity. Environmental factors can drastically blur the timeline, making it incredibly tricky to accurately estimate when an individual drew their final breath. My initial gut feeling suggested she lingered beneath the surface for quite a few sunrises, helping us piece together a solid working hypothesis. By that specific stage of the investigation, a very disturbing scenario started playing out in my mind. A malicious perpetrator clearly transported her under the cover of darkness, casually tossing her remains over a bridge or dropping her straight off the stern of a vessel. A closer visual inspection revealed standard supermarket sacks deliberately tethered to the victim's limbs. The killer obviously used heavy objects to anchor her beneath the surface until the makeshift ballast eventually tore through the plastic, allowing her remains to finally float upward. Forensic clues left at the scene painted an incredibly harrowing picture of the terror she endured right before the end. We additionally recovered a dark elastic strap that had been utilized to heavily restrain the poor girl. They found window spline pulled tightly around her neck, and her body was brutally bound with a sturdy piece of nylon rope. The restraints were colored red and white, and thick layers of tape were completely wrapped around the victim's head. Someone wanted total physical control over her, which explains exactly why she was bound and tied up so securely. It is absolutely heartbreaking to think that this poor woman likely spent her final moments begging for her life. The investigators now face the grim task of deciding exactly how many of these gruesome details to share with her grieving family. There is simply no gentle way to inform a family that their precious loved one has been brutally murdered, so experience has taught me that delivering the tragic news straight is always the best approach. When her mother finally opened the front door and locked eyes with us, she instantly recognized that we were police detectives. The mother immediately asked, "It is her, is it not?" And I softly confirmed, yes, it is her, since she had seen the local news and grew terrified when her daughter never made it home. She was practically waiting for us to arrive, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming shock and unsure of how to react. The entire ordeal still sends shivers down my spine, especially since I was raising kids around her exact age back then. As a loving parent, you always look at your own kids and see them as innocent little children no matter what. My heart truly ached for her as she reached out to her former husband, Bob Morris, who was residing on the western coast of Florida. The moment I picked up the receiver, I was met with her agonizing screams echoing, "She is dead. She has been murdered," she cried out, to which I frantically replied, "What happened? Who is calling? What are you saying?" She managed to gasp out, "Misty is gone," and my knees grew so weak that I literally almost collapsed onto the floor. I begged to know what happened, and she sobbed, "Someone took her life, and they just discovered her body floating in the water." I felt utterly helpless in that moment because the entire tragedy felt completely senseless and left us desperately begging for answers. What kind of monster could commit such a heinous act? Desperate for the truth, her family began sharing intimate details of her life with the authorities. Her grieving mother fondly recalled the beautiful story behind naming her baby girl, proudly calling her Misty April Morris. Brought into this world on a deeply foggy morning, she grew up to become an incredibly independent and beautifully free spirit. She undeniably danced to the beat of her own drum, especially as a vibrant 22-year-old woman finding her way. She had finally reached that exciting chapter in life where she felt completely unstoppable and ready to chase down any wild adventure she desired. I truly believe she was in the middle of a profound journey of self-discovery, trying to map out her passions and find her ultimate destination in life. The investigation quickly pivoted to her final known moments, back when she was sharing a cozy little apartment with her devoted mother. According to her mother, she had wrapped up her shift and arrived back at the apartment right around midnight on that fateful Wednesday. Through the thin walls, she clearly heard her daughter having an engaging conversation on the telephone with a mystery caller. They chatted for a brief moment, and shortly after hanging up, the phone rang again with yet another incoming call. Her mother noted that the initial ring happened right at 2 in the morning, followed by a second call exactly 20 minutes later. She vividly remembered her daughter bursting into the bedroom, doing a playful twirl, and happily asking, "How does my outfit look?" She mentioned that she was heading out for a late date with a familiar face, and she seemed genuinely thrilled about the meetup. Unfortunately, her mother had absolutely no clue who this mysterious late-night companion actually was. Once her daughter walked out the door, she drifted back to sleep and woke up for her regular work shift the very next morning. Her mother attempted to dial her number a few times just to check in and see when she planned on heading back home. She never managed to reach her, though missing a call from her was honestly not entirely out of the ordinary at the time. It was pretty standard for her to spontaneously vanish on adventures with friends, but the sheer panic truly set in when she failed to return the following day. Combining the family's timeline with the grim state of her remains, detectives were able to pinpoint the time of death and zero in on a solid suspect. Based on the evidence, she vanished during the early hours where Wednesday night bleeds into Thursday morning, only to be discovered late Sunday afternoon. My professional instinct told me she ended up in that icy water almost immediately after her final interaction with her mother. Given her upbeat mood while walking out the front door, it was blatantly obvious she was meeting up with an acquaintance she trusted. We felt incredibly certain that the individual she chose to step out with that night was the very same monster who took her life. Investigators strongly suspected the anonymous caller was the killer, so they pleaded with her mother to help unmask his hidden identity. I looked her in the eye and promised that our department would stand by her side until we successfully solved this tragic case. She bravely rattled off the names of absolutely everyone she knew who had ever been a part of her daughter's social circle. As she combed through the extensive list of contacts, one particular name practically jumped off the page. Teddy Underwood was a complicated figure, perhaps more than a friend, but not quite a boyfriend. Introduced to her by a mutual pal, Teddy was definitely easy on the eyes, and he actually had a brief romantic history with the victim right before she passed away. Investigators dug into his past and stumbled upon a rather significant piece of information. It turned out he possessed a rap sheet featuring burglary alongside a disturbing accusation of sexual violence or battery. Discovering a potential suspect with a history of sexual misconduct automatically raises a massive red flag for law enforcement. Officers immediately needed to figure out if this individual possessed the capacity for murder, catapulting him straight up the ranks. He instantly became their absolute #1 priority on the suspect list. Authorities leveraged his rap sheet to track his whereabouts, only to discover he possessed an incredibly slick tongue. This specific individual required intense scrutiny from my end as we sat down for a formal conversation. The main goal is simply locking them into a solid narrative rather than subjecting them to a relentless interrogation. Think of it as a crucial fact-finding expedition designed solely to establish a reliable sequence of events. We turned up the heat, yet he remained remarkably unfazed while insisting he knew exactly why we suspected him. He acknowledged our suspicions but firmly denied any involvement, claiming their fling was incredibly brief and purely physical. Both of them simply walked away from what was ultimately a fleeting and incredibly casual romance. You constantly evaluate their narrative to see if the pieces fit together while closely observing their overall body language. You really have to gauge whether they are dodging questions or actively volunteering helpful information to the case. The suspect maintained he had not crossed paths with her for over 7 days, claiming he hung out with buddies early Thursday. His alibi checked out completely. Plus, he showed absolutely no enthusiasm for rivers or boating activities while appearing remarkably genuine. The man was an open book, and my natural detective instincts simply never sounded the alarm bells regarding his involvement. With their primary suspect officially ruled out, investigators pivoted to the medical examination, hoping to unearth fresh leads pointing toward the culprit. The victim lacked visible gunshot or knife injuries, yet physical remains often whisper secret truths to highly trained professionals. Operating strictly from the critical perspective of a seasoned law enforcement official reveals a ton of crucial details. Discovering a bound and gagged victim discarded in a waterway heavily suggests they were still breathing upon entering the depths, because restraining a corpse serves zero purpose. Following that specific logic, succumbing to the watery depths emerges as an incredibly probable cause of demise. Folks often wrongly assume that discovering liquid inside a victim's lungs or stomach automatically guarantees they met a watery end. The scientific reality proves that surrounding fluids can naturally seep into those internal cavities long after someone has taken their final breath. Therefore, locating moisture within their digestive or respiratory tracts absolutely does not guarantee drowning was the actual mechanism of fatality. Unfortunately, the coroner completely refused to officially stamp a definitive reason for her tragic passing. However, the broader classification of the crime itself remained glaringly obvious to absolutely everyone involved: cold-blooded murder. Forensics experts continued their meticulous dig, desperately hunting for microscopic evidence completely invisible to standard observation. During a post-mortem evaluation, professionals meticulously inspect both the physical remains and absolutely every single item clinging to the victim. Microscopic analysis frequently reveals tiny anomalies that make absolutely zero sense during the initial stages of an inquiry. Those clues only click once the case develops further. For example, peeling back the adhesive from her face uncovered a single mysterious hair. Finding that strand offered a glimmer of hope, though investigators needed substantial elbow grease to turn it into actionable intelligence. Genetic profiling remains an absolute powerhouse in murder cases, provided detectives actually possess a matching sample from a viable suspect. Wrapping up the coroner's duties perfectly coincided with her dad walking into the precinct to drop a fresh suspect right in their laps. She had recently bragged about dating a handsome, wealthy military veteran who previously served as a Navy SEAL. It turned out she was involved in a fairly serious romance with a local gentleman named Brent Huck. Her father voiced his intense disdain for the man, describing him as an arrogant show-off who constantly flaunted his wealth. This new person of interest deliberately cultivated a highly rebellious, tough guy image around town. That aggressive edge practically acted like a magnet for local women and his loyal circle of friends. The victim was incredibly prone to taking wild risks, which honestly perfectly describes almost every 22-year-old out there. Young adults generally walk around feeling 10 feet tall, absolutely invincible, and destined to cheat death indefinitely, which terrified folks who knew her back then. Relatives often questioned if she would survive past age 18, since she constantly gravitated towards shady characters and endless mischief. Despite that chaotic history, her family genuinely believed she had finally outgrown that rebellious phase. Regarding her toxic, on-again, off-again dynamic with Brent, loved ones constantly reminded her that she deserved someone vastly superior. Cut ties with this dude immediately, because he is absolutely nothing but trouble. Naturally, any mother or father will tell you that forbidding a child from doing something is a guaranteed way to make them do it. We were tipped off to check out Brent Huck, which led our investigators straight to his folks' luxurious property located out on Merritt Island. Our arrival was a complete surprise to him, and we crossed our fingers that this encounter would finally break the case wide open. We pounded on the front entrance, stood there for a minute, and listened to a hound making a racket inside. He eventually opened up, allowing us to dive right into questioning regarding his past romance with Misty and where things currently stood between them. He estimated that they had been acquainted for roughly 18 to 24 months, give or take. Following a stint of dating, he claimed they briefly cohabitated for about 8 weeks before Agent Harold suddenly caught a glimpse of a glaring red flag. Scrapes and cuts were clearly visible all over his fingers and palms, prompting me to confront him directly about the source of the injuries. His excuse was that his pet dragged him along while he was riding a longboard, resulting in severe friction marks across his skin. Those wounds were clearly scraped skin rather than friction burns, so investigators immediately dragged him into the precinct to interrogate him further. We convinced him that coming down to the precinct was simply the best way to completely clear his own name from the suspect list. The suspect answered our questions without hesitation, eventually confessing that his romantic involvement with the victim had never actually concluded. He described their dynamic as less of an actual bond and much more of a casual arrangement where they both understood the underlying expectation. In his mind, he retained an open invitation to drop by her place. He basically strung her along for quite a while. Tell me about the final time you two were intimate together. I believe it happened on the 11th. Yes, definitely the 11th. Is that what you need to know? Absolutely. Did this happen at your place or hers? We were over at her spot. This occurred exactly 9 days prior to Misty vanishing without a trace. Eventually, Brent confessed that their situation had recently spiraled into a rather messy ordeal. A couple of his buddies reached out over the phone to tell him they had just bumped into Misty, and it looked like she was expecting a baby. That very same evening, she vanished. Brent dialed her number to demand some answers. He flat out questioned her about the rumors. I demanded to know what on earth was actually happening here. I reminded her that she definitely did not look pregnant when we hung out on the 11th, so I wanted to know why these rumors were spreading. You have completely destroyed my entire existence. Once Brent Huck confessed to ringing Misty on the evening of her death, investigators immediately bumped him to the top of their suspect list. He explained to our team that he dialed her number specifically to chew her out, demanding she stop spreading those lies because he was already in a committed relationship. I really laid into her over the phone, and after that, we agreed to meet up and hash the whole thing out. I clearly recall dialing her number again about 5 minutes later just to offer a quick thank you before ending the call. So you chewed her out regarding the baby rumors. As an investigator, you have to carefully evaluate the story this guy is spinning. You have to wonder if his timeline actually aligns with the established facts. For the investigative team, pinpointing the exact moments those conversations happened is absolutely crucial. At what time did you actually speak with her? I would estimate it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 o'clock, probably between 3 and 4 in the morning. That window falls more than 60 minutes past the initial conversations that ultimately drove Misty to step out of her house. By placing his own timeline squarely between 3:30 and 4 o'clock, he conveniently provides himself with a solid alibi for the critical window. Furthermore, Brent insists he was completely out of the area and nowhere near her residence during that fateful evening. He eventually headed back to his folks' place where he was living at the time. I was pretty heavily buzzed, so I would definitely classify it as a totally wild evening. The guy had been drinking heavily and living it up long before he ever picked up the phone to dial her number. He was out with a large crew of friends. They spent the entire evening hopping between various local taverns and knocking back drinks. Eventually, they crashed at a buddy's place to keep the celebration going. After a while, he dialed up a different girl to come pick him up and drive him back to his place. According to Brent, he was out cold under the covers by 4 in the morning, and his buddies completely backed up the story about the young woman dropping him off. The guy supposedly stayed put at his folks' place until dawn, and while he definitely had a reason to pull something like this, his current story actually checks out perfectly. Working murder cases is a relentless 24/7 grind that absolutely drains the life right out of you. You can't just unbuckle your holster at the end of a shift, toss it aside, and let it all go, because every single investigation permanently burns itself into your memory. Sleep constantly gets interrupted by sudden thoughts of missed clues better questions, or completely different moves you realize you should have made. The investigative team remained absolutely convinced that the ultimate answer was still hiding out there. To figure out exactly who dialed Misty in the dark, they kept aggressively questioning her inner circle about her private life. That relentless digging eventually pointed us straight toward a fresh suspect named Bobby Cooper, a guy who acted like he was already waiting for the cops to show up, and we certainly didn't disappoint. During our sit-down, the man practically broke down in tears, showing genuine distress. A person's physical response often reveals way more than whatever they happen to be saying. Sometimes they shed genuine tears, while other times they completely exaggerate the waterworks. After handling countless interrogations, your gut instinct kicks in to help determine if their emotional display is authentic or totally fake. He confessed his deep affection for her, explaining that their brief time together had been an absolute roller coaster since they first crossed paths. The subject was incredibly chatty, eagerly responding to every single inquiry I threw his way. He detailed their final movie date, mentioning how he repeatedly blew up her phone afterward without any luck, leading him to assume they were finished. He figured her complete radio silence was simply her method for cutting ties and moving on. Bobby informed the authorities that they eventually connected, claiming they chatted on the exact evening she vanished. He claimed to have caught up with her Tuesday evening and again the following day, prompting me to ask if he had specifically dialed her cell directly. He confirmed he did, which immediately made me ask exactly how many conversations they shared throughout Wednesday. He stated they only spoke a single time that day, placing the chat somewhere right around 7 or 7:30 in the evening. Confirming that phone call was a crucial detail for us, especially since Bobby mentioned attempting to reach her once more late Thursday. Facing dead air, he proceeded to drop multiple voicemails into her inbox. Murderers frequently flood their victim's device with voicemails as a clever tactic to establish a fake alibi. Investigators usually view this specific behavior as the culprit's calculated effort to mislead law enforcement. It serves to distract grieving relatives and derail the entire case. But then Bobby shocked Agent Harold by spontaneously confessing something major. Bobby randomly admitted to holding her identification card, which happened to be a crucial missing item we were actively hunting down. Whenever you are caught holding a deceased individual's belongings, you absolutely need a bulletproof story to justify possessing those items. Without a rock-solid excuse, you are practically guaranteeing yourself a one-way ticket to prison for the homicide. Having Misty Morse's identification card instantly painted a massive target on Bobby Cooper's back as our prime suspect. When questioned about acquiring her ID, he claimed it had been in his possession ever since their theater date. He explained her outfit lacked any pockets, so she simply asked him to carry the card for convenience. His justification was essentially that holding her belongings ensured they would have to meet up for a second date. He likely assumed that acting defensive or refusing to help would immediately cement his status as our primary target. Bobby insisted he was kicking back at his house alongside his relatives when Misty lost her life. His father completely backed up his alibi, leaving us convinced that Bobby was definitely innocent. We needed to shift our focus and explore other leads entirely. Working as a murder detective requires an immense amount of restraint and collaboration across a large team. Various detectives interrogate separate witnesses, eventually regrouping to compare notes and evaluate everyone's statement. Our job is simply analyzing the collected data and assembling the puzzle to see the bigger picture. Every single person provided solid alibis and clarified their connections to her, so we just pushed onward with the hunt. Out of nowhere, law enforcement finally secured the critical breakthrough they had been desperately anticipating. Misty's cellular logs finally arrived, completely breaking down every single conversation down to the precise second. The detailed documents exposed exactly who dialed her up and precisely how many minutes each chat lasted, breaking everything down line by line. The data ultimately painted a crystal clear picture of her final day. The paperwork backed up Bobby Cooper's claims, clearly showing his relentless attempts to reach her device. Crucially, the logs confirmed Brent Huck's story about ringing her mobile exactly 2 times. Brent initially claimed he dialed around 4 in the morning, but the actual timestamps proved it was closer to 2 or 2:20 in the morning. Those rings from Brent Huck aligned perfectly with the time window Misty's mother had mentioned regarding late-night disturbances. Weaving a convincing fib is simple when you use factual details but cleverly tweak the exact hours the moment an individual gets busted feeding false information to investigators. Things escalate quickly. Authorities immediately flag them as a person of interest, heavily scrutinizing their motives for avoiding the plain truth. Detectives have to uncover the hidden agenda behind the deception, especially knowing Brent and Misty shared a turbulent history. The man was actively spinning a web of deceit and trapping himself in a massive falsehood. Detectives started poking around in his private affairs, eventually uncovering a seriously compelling reason for the crime. Turns out he had a new lady down in Palm Beach County, and rumor had it she came from some serious old money and possessed major social influence. The happy couple was actually closing on a property down in South Florida, not to mention tossing around ideas for their upcoming nuptials. Things were definitely getting serious between the two of them, except he still had one massive headache back home in the form of Misty, whom he completely refused to cut loose. In hindsight, it makes you wonder if that sparked her sudden urge to announce a fake pregnancy to the whole town, secretly hoping the scandalous news would eventually reach his new fiancée. Law enforcement decided to drop in on the new girl, and from what I gathered, she remained completely in the dark regarding his ongoing fling back home. In her mind, she held the exclusive title of being his one and only romantic interest at that specific moment in time. Deeply troubled by the revelation that her partner was now wrapped up in a murder probe, she immediately agreed to play ball with the detectives. A classic strategy in our playbook involves shaking the tree just enough to see what falls out. We often ask a trusted confidant to reach out and chat with the target, hoping the comfortable dynamic will trick them into dropping their guard and spilling a crucial detail. During their conversation, she casually dropped the bomb that the authorities were knocking on her door to ask questions about the recent homicide. She explicitly warned him that the cops were treating him as their prime suspect, and he simply acknowledged the grim reality. When she pressed him to confess before the ugly truth hit the fan, he aggressively shut her down and stubbornly refused to discuss a single detail over the cellular line. He snapped at her probing questions, boldly reiterating his absolute refusal to utter another word while the device was actively transmitting their voices. He demanded a face-to-face meeting if she really needed the full story, foolishly attempting to brush off the entire murder investigation as some trivial misunderstanding. After abruptly ending the call, that recorded conversation practically screamed that our primary suspect was harboring some massive rage problems behind closed doors. You could almost feel the panic setting in as he realized his double life was rapidly crumbling right in front of his face. Naturally, his current flame demanded answers and was absolutely furious about his betrayal, which gave us a huge psychological window into how his twisted mind actually operated. Listening to that audio gave me massive chills, cementing my absolute certainty that we had just cornered the exact monster who pulled this off. Now that our primary target was sitting squarely in the hot seat, the team decided to systematically dismantle his supposed foolproof excuse for that fateful evening. In his initial statement, the guy swore up and down that he stumbled through his front door somewhere around 3:30 in the morning. We managed to track down the friendly girl who gave him a lift after the bars closed, discovering she only offered the ride because his place was conveniently located along her route. To her, it was just a casual favor, yet she distinctly remembered tossing him the keys right at 2 o'clock in the dead of night. That blew a massive 2-hour hole in his carefully constructed timeline, leaving him with plenty of unverified freedom to swing by the victim's house to commit the crime. Since she was the final verified witness to see him breathing that night, we specifically grilled her about any visible cuts or bruising on his knuckles. She confirmed his skin was completely flawless, proving the violent struggle occurred hours later, which prompted our squad to knock on his front door for a highly anticipated sequel. By then, our suspect had already lawyered up heavily, and his high-priced counsel immediately slapped a massive gag order on him regarding our inquiries. That wall of silence hardly mattered, because a judge swiftly signed off on our paperwork to toss his property a second time. The raid yielded a treasure trove of evidence in the garage, including specialized window cording, thick nautical rigging, and a massive stash of local grocery sacks tucked beneath the plumbing. Sure, any average Joe could easily have a random assortment of bright bulbs and sticky adhesive laying around their tool bench. You might even excuse a gigantic hoard of crumpled shopping sacks. but the mathematical probability of hoarding that specific deadly trio is practically zero. Forensics managed to trace the synthetic cording right back to the manufacturer, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that it rolled off the identical assembly line as the makeshift handcuffs. The sticky residue told an equally damning story once the lab coats threw it under their high-powered microscopes. We are talking about an absolutely flawless match to the bindings wrapped around her corpse, sharing identical branding, synthetic makeup, and that highly distinct hue. Throw in the undeniable fact that he dialed her cell right before her death, and suddenly the entire puzzle practically solved itself right before our eyes. While the legal eagles love to dismiss this kind of stuff as purely indirect, the sheer volume of coincidence was painting him firmly into an inescapable corner. The ultimate nail in his coffin actually turned out to be a microscopic pet follicle snagged on the victim's clothing, ultimately identified as canine fuzz. Unsurprisingly, our prime suspect owned a very specific four-legged friend, and the subsequent genetic sequencing completely slammed the prison doors shut on it. The boys in the lab didn't just give us a generic breed match, they completely verified that this microscopic strand belonged to his personal mutt. By the time October 2002 rolled around, a grand jury slapped the guy with capital murder and abduction, entirely thanks to our meticulously rebuilt sequence of events. The way I envision the tragedy unfolding is she clocked out and crashed at her place while he was busy hitting the local dive bar. Somewhere amidst the chaos of the night, someone whispers that his ex is parading around town claiming she is carrying his child, which flips a dangerous switch in his head. Facing a massive hometown scandal, the absolute last thing this guy could stomach was his wealthy new fiancée catching wind of an illegitimate baby drama. In his twisted reality, permanently silencing his former flame became the only logical solution to protect his bright future. Fueled by alcohol and massive entitlement, he stumbles onto his driveway near 2 in the morning, absolutely seething with unhinged rage. This guy grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth. He likely dialed her number with the fake excuse of a late-night hookup, just like their usual routine, before heading over to her place. That explains the incredibly brief ring from downstairs, which wrapped up in maybe 10 seconds flat. She walks out the door, hops into the passenger seat, and they hit the road toward his place. I truly believe he spent that entire drive plotting a permanent end to her story, Lord help me. He somehow managed to overpower a son, a driver, a secret lover. The most dangerous threat in these cases wore the face of a familiar person. Detectives who solved these cases did not rely on luck. They relied on patience, phone records, surveillance tapes, and refusing to quit. They rebuilt timelines hour by hour. They noticed when someone cried too much or not enough. They followed one stolen credit card 57 miles to the truth. The people closest to us carry the most power to protect us or destroy us. These cases remind us that warning signs are rarely invisible. They are simply ignored, minimized, or explained away until it is too late. Trust your instincts. Document threats. Tell someone when something feels wrong. A reported concern could be the one detail that saves a life. Justice came in every one of these cases. Not quickly, not easily, but because investigators refused to let the evidence go cold. If these stories moved you, share them. Someone in your community may need the reminder that violence rarely comes from a stranger. Subscribe to stay with us as we continue uncovering the cases that demand to be remembered and the victims who deserve to be seen. 3 families, 3 calculated murders, 3 killers who believed they would never be caught. In Coral Gables, a mother was shot dead in her own bed while her husband barely survived a bullet to the skull. In Greenwich, a millionaire was found bound and stabbed in his basement by the very men he trusted most. And in a quiet town, a young woman was pulled from her home in the middle of the night and never came back alive. In every single case, investigators had one urgent mission: reconstruct the final 24 hours before the violence began. That window holds everything. Every phone call, every visitor, every lie told to someone who trusted the wrong person. In Coral Gables, the killer sat at the dinner table, ate birthday cake, and said goodnight before ordering the hit. In Greenwich, the murderer drove across state lines, powered down his phone, and paid cash at the toll booth to erase his trail. The details that seem small, a midnight phone call, a missing toll record, a dog hair on a jacket, cracked every case wide open. Greed lit the fuse in nearly every story. A multi-million-dollar inheritance, a fraudulent empire about to collapse, a pregnancy that threatened a reputation. But greed alone does not commit murder. It needs proximity, it needs access, it needs someone the victim already trusted.